If you enjoy this detailed look into hidden history, please consider subscribing for more content like this. The year was 1957. The city of Hamburg, West Germany, was a place of frantic reconstruction and profound tension. Rebuilt from the rubble of the war, its port, the largest in Germany, was a gateway not only for commerce but for secrets. The city existed in the British zone of occupation, yet it pressed up against the border of the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, GDR, a state that was hardening with every passing month. The Cold War was not a metaphor here. It was the chill draft felt in every warehouse, the suspicious glance in every Kneipe. In an austere office overlooking the St. Pauli Landungsbrücken, Arthur Donovan, a case officer for the Central Intelligence Agency, watched a freighter steam up the Elbe. Donovan was a man defined by the era, gray suit, methodical habits, and a deep-seated analytical weariness. He was a logistician of the clandestine. His station, operating under the cover of a U.S. consulate trade mission, was tasked with one of the CIA's most difficult mandates: penetrate the Iron Curtain. By 1957, the land routes were treacherous, the Berlin air corridors too closely monitored. The agency needed a new platform, a reliable, repeatable method for inserting and extracting assets, both human and material, into the Eastern Bloc. The solution, codenamed Operation Sea Harvest, was Atlantic Meridian Shipping, AMS. To the world, AMS was a minor, struggling freight line. It operated two aging tramp steamers, the SS Albatross and the SS Osprey, leased under a Panamanian shell corporation and financed through a labyrinth of accounts in Zurich. Its manifests listed legitimate, if low-value cargo: ball bearings from Sweden, textiles from Britain, machine parts from Belgium. Its primary route was a triangle: Hamburg to Copenhagen, then to the GDR port of Rostock, and back. It was designed to be overlooked, a gray ship against a gray sea. The operation required two key components. The first was the mechanism. On the Albatross, CIA technicians, working in a restricted dry dock in Bremerhaven, had modified a standard 20-foot shipping container. They had expertly built a false wall, creating a hidden compartment roughly 3 feet deep. It was ventilated, soundproofed, and accessible only by activating two separate magnetic locks disguised as bolts on the container's exterior. The container itself was always manifested as spare parts for AMS's fictional Rostock office. The second component was the human one. Klaus Becker, known by his operational cryptonym Rudolph, was the asset. Becker was an engineer who had fled Rostock in 1953, leaving a sister and extended family behind. This family was the leverage the agency used, promising to ease their way, to get them permissions, to get them out, all in exchange for his help. Becker was intelligent, quiet, and driven by a potent mixture of hope and resentment. He knew the port of Rostock, its layout, its people, and its vulnerabilities. On the other side, in Rostock, was Major Marcus Schmidt of the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, MFS, or Stasi. Schmidt worked for the Hauptabteilung II, J2, the Counterintelligence Directorate. Unlike the stereotypical image of a secret policeman, Schmidt was a bureaucrat. He distrusted drama and believed in paperwork. He believed that all espionage, no matter how complex, was ultimately a logistical problem, and that every logistical problem left a trail of receipts, manifests, and anomalies. His primary task was securing the Ostsee coast, and he had recently begun to wonder about the increasing number of small, seemingly unprofitable Western shipping companies making regular calls at the port. The establishment of Atlantic Meridian Shipping was a model of clandestine bureaucracy. Donovan had spent months building its legend. He hired a retired and heavily indebted British merchant captain named Thomas Finch to command the SS Albatross. Finch was not an ideologue. He was compromised, paid handsomely to ask no questions about the special parts container that was loaded last and unloaded first, always handled by a trusted ground crew. The ground crew in Hamburg was a small team of vetted German assets, while the local office in Rostock consisted of 2 men, a manager and a truck driver, both recruited from disaffected local populations, both unaware of the true nature of the cargo. They believed they were smuggling Western currency and high-end consumer goods. a belief Donovan encouraged as it was a plausible, non-political crime. Klaus Becker's training was rigorous. He was taken to a safe house in the Taunus Mountains, outside Frankfurt. For 6 weeks, he was taught the fundamentals of tradecraft, microdot photography, the creation and servicing of dead drops, coded communication using classified ads in the Neues Deutschland newspaper, and, most importantly, the art of blending in. He was to be an engineer again, but one who noticed things, specifically Soviet submarine specifications and the new radar installations being built by the Volksmarine. The system had its first test in March 1957. A dry run was initiated. The SS Albatross left Hamburg with the modified container, empty save for a few boxes of machine parts to provide appropriate weight. Captain Finch navigated to Copenhagen as scheduled. There, a Danish customs patrol, acting on a random tip about tobacco smuggling, boarded the ship. Donovan, posing as the AMS cargo manager, was on board for the initial voyage. He watched as the Danish officers walked the deck. A young, eager officer stopped at the special container. He noted its manifest. "Spare parts," he read, tapping the steel wall with a metal rod. "We have a small office in Rostock. Always breaking down their equipment," Donovan said calmly, offering the man an American cigarette. The officer tapped the wall again. The sound was solid. The CIA's engineers had insulated it perfectly. But then he examined the bolts, the ones hiding the magnetic locks. He pulled at one. It didn't budge. He grunted, applied more pressure, and then shrugged. It was just another container on a gray ship. He accepted the cigarette, and the inspection moved on. Donovan exhaled slowly. The system had held, but the incident was a stark reminder of the operation's fragility. A single suspicious customs officer, a loose rivet, a moment of bad luck. Any of it could unravel the entire platform. The incident was logged in Donovan's report to Langley as minor customs friction. But for him, it was a clear sign that Sea Harvest was living on borrowed time. The tension was palpable. The operation was clean, but it felt exposed to the elements. The discovery of Operation Sea Harvest did not begin with a high-level defector or a brilliant piece of signals intelligence. It began, as Major Marcus Schmidt expected it would, in the ledger books. By late 1957, Schmidt's HA2 office in Rostock was deep in an analysis of all foreign shipping entities using the port. He was looking for inefficiency. The GDR, desperate for foreign currency, encouraged trade, but Schmidt understood that the port was the nation's softest flank. He was examining monthly profit and loss statements declared by these companies to the State Maritime Authority. Atlantic Meridian Shipping stood out, precisely because it tried so hard not to. Its cargo manifests were always filled with low-margin goods, ball bearings, spare parts, bulk textiles. The revenue declared was barely enough to cover fuel and docking fees. Yet, the SS Albatross and SS Osprey never missed a scheduled run. They were reliable, like a state-run railway, and private commerce was never that predictable, especially when it wasn't profitable. They are either fanatics for the sea, Schmidt dictated to his secretary, or they are subsidized. And the only entity willing to subsidize a failing shipping line into Rostock, he reasoned, was an enemy intelligence service. This was a theory, but Schmidt needed proof. He activated a low-level informant, an inofficieller Mitarbeiter, IM, codenamed Siegel. EM Siegel was a dock worker, a man who believed he was helping the Kriminalpolizei, criminal police, investigate smuggling rings. Schmidt tasked Siegel with a simple request: observe the crew of the SS Albatross when they had shore leave. Siegel reported back a week later. The crew, including Captain Finch, were quiet. They kept to themselves, drank at the designated International Seamen's Club, and returned to the ship. All except one, the first mate. This man, Siegel reported, always met with the local AMS truck driver. They would share a coffee, and the driver would leave with a small, heavy package, always a packet of Dunhill cigarettes. Schmidt knew Western cigarettes were a common black market currency, but the first mate was giving them to the truck driver, not the other way around. This was payment. The second piece of the puzzle came from the AMS office itself, a small rented room above a bakery. Schmidt's team had placed it under surveillance. The office manager rarely did any business. He received no local telegraphs, took no new shipping orders. His only activity was on the days the Albatross docked. On those days, the truck driver would arrive, drop off the Dunhill packet, and retrieve a small container. The truck would then drive to the warehouse, load a single crate, and drive it to the dock. It was the crate that bothered Schmidt. It was always the same crate, manifested as spare parts. It was never opened, never inspected, and always returned to Hamburg. Schmidt cross-referenced the manifests. The same crate, with the same serial number, had been shipped back and forth between Hamburg and Rostock 7 times in 4 months. A company that ships the same spare parts back and forth without ever using them, while losing money on every voyage, Schmidt concluded, is not a company. It is a taxi. Major Schmidt initiated Operation Anchor. The objective was no longer to determine if AMS was a hostile platform, but to determine what it was carrying. The full resources of the MFS district apparatus were mobilized. Surveillance teams from HA2, augmented by observation specialists from Hauptabteilung E8, Observation Investigation, established a 24-hour post in an apartment across from the AMS warehouse. They photographed every arrival and departure. They tapped the office telephone line, a fruitless effort as the manager only ever received calls confirming the ship's arrival time, all in innocuous German. The key was the container. Schmidt did not want to seize it. A premature move would alert the Americans, who would simply dissolve AMS and create a new front. He needed to catch the cargo. He had to know who was using this taxi. In January 1958, Klaus Becker, Rudolph, made his first successful infiltration. The SS Albatross docked during a mild snowstorm. The AMS truck picked up the spare parts container and drove it to the warehouse. Becker waited inside the cramped, dark compartment for 2 hours, a standard procedure to ensure the ship was clear and the warehouse secure. Finally, he heard the 3 soft knocks on the steel wall, the all clear from the truck driver. He operated the internal locks and stepped out. The driver handed him his forged identification papers, a small amount of East German currency, and the keys to a bicycle. "Good luck," the driver muttered, his eyes averted. Becker nodded, mounted the bicycle, and disappeared into the snowy streets of Rostock. He had 3 months. The Stasi surveillance team photographed him leaving. They had their who. They did not arrest him. Schmidt was patient. An agent was useless without his network and his mission. For the next 3 months, Schmidt's teams tracked Rudolph. They were ghosts, documenting his every move. They watched him perform a surveillance detection route, SDR, on his way to his rented room. They watched him place a chalk mark on a bridge railing, a signal. They watched him conduct a brush pass with a contact near the Neptune Werft shipyard, exchanging a newspaper for a small packet. Schmidt's team identified the contact, a draftsman at the shipyard. The draftsman was promptly and quietly placed under surveillance. A new operation, Compass, was opened on him. Through Rudolph, the Stasi was mapping the CIA's network. They learned his dead drop locations, his communication codes, based on stock figures in the newspaper, and his operational schedule. They knew what he was gathering, technical specifications on new Soviet-designed submarine hulls. Back in Hamburg, Arthur Donovan read Rudolph's coded signals with satisfaction. The mission was a success. The asset was active. The platform was secure. He began planning the exfiltration, scheduled for early April. In his Rostock office, Major Schmidt also prepared for the exfiltration. He had the how, the container, the who, Rudolph, the what, the shipyard plans, and the when, the Albatross's next arrival. The trap was set. Operation Anchor was moving from surveillance to confrontation. April 3, 1958. The SS Albatross steamed into Rostock Harbor under a heavy gray sky. Captain Finch guided the ship to its usual berth. On the dock, I.M. Seagull watched, his presence now just a formality. The real observers were Schmidt's men, disguised as dock workers, customs officials, and Volkspolizei. In Hamburg, Arthur Donovan felt a familiar knot in his stomach. The exfiltration was always the most dangerous part. The asset was hot, carrying evidence. Rudolph had sent the final all-clear signal via a coded advertisement, Seeking textbook, Mechanics of Materials, 1952 edition. Everything appeared normal, but Donovan had received a vague report from Station Berlin. MFS counterintelligence was unusually active in the Rostock district. He debated scrubbing the mission, telling Rudolph to go to ground. But the intelligence he carried was time-sensitive. The Navy was starting sea trials. Donovan gave the proceed signal. That evening, Klaus Becker made his way from his safe house to the AMS warehouse. He had the microdots, containing photos of the technical drawings, sealed inside a hollowed-out bolt. He felt the profound relief of a mission completed. He was going home. He approached the warehouse, used his key, and entered the dark, damp space. The spare parts container sat in its usual spot. He checked his watch. 22 Briseau. The truck driver, who was supposed to be there, was absent. This was a deviation. Becker paused, his senses screaming. He listened. There was only the sound of wind rattling the corrugated tin roof. He reasoned the driver was simply late, or perhaps waiting outside as an extra lookout. He couldn't wait. He approached the container, pulled the magnetic tool disguised as a wrench from his bag, and placed it over the hidden locks. The heavy thud of the mechanism's releasing echoed in the silence. He pulled the false wall open and prepared to climb inside. "That will not be necessary, Herr Becker." The voice was calm, bureaucratic. The overhead floodlights snapped on, blinding Klaus. He froze, one hand on the container's edge. Major Marcus Schmidt stepped out from behind a stack of crates. He was not holding a weapon. He was holding a clipboard. Two uniformed Volkspolizei officers stood by the main door. "Your operation is terminated," Schmidt stated, as if closing a file. "The intelligence you have collected, please place it on the floor." Slowly, Klaus Becker looked from Schmidt to the officers. There was no escape. The confrontation he had trained for, the one involving a chase, perhaps a struggle, never materialized. This was not a capture, it was an audit. The months of paranoia, the fear, the loneliness, it all collapsed into this sterile, administrative moment. He slowly reached into his pocket, retrieved the bolt, and tossed it onto the concrete floor. It skittered to a stop at Schmidt's feet. On the SS Albatross, Captain Finch was overseeing the loading of textiles. A man in a docker's uniform approached him. "Captain Finch, a problem with your cargo manifest. Major Schmidt of the Maritime Authority needs to see you." Finch felt a cold dread. He had an emergency phrase, a signal to the first mate to scuttle the ship's log, but when he turned, the first mate was already flanked by two other dockers. Finch was escorted off his ship. The SS Albatross was seized under the pretext of gross customs violations and suspicion of smuggling. The trap was sprung. The neutralization of Operation Sea Harvest was swift and comprehensive. As Klaus Becker was led away in handcuffs, a separate Stasi team entered the AMS office above the bakery, arresting the manager. The truck driver had been picked up 2 hours earlier at his apartment. Within an hour, the entire Rostock-based network of Atlantic Meridian shipping ceased to exist. On the SS Albatross, Schmidt's technical team, guided by the surveillance reports, immediately located the spare parts container. They didn't need the magnetic keys. A team with cutting torches spent 30 minutes bypassing the locks, revealing the hidden compartment. Schmidt inspected it himself, noting the American-made ventilation unit and the insulated walls. It was, he admitted, impressive work. The ship's crew was detained. Captain Finch, the first mate, and the two CIA-vetted crewmen were separated for interrogation. The rest of the sailors were confined to their quarters, their shore leave indefinitely revoked. In Hamburg, Arthur Donovan was monitoring the channel. The Albatross was due to send its all-clear signal, a standard commercial telegraph confirming its departure schedule, at 23:01. 23:01 passed. Silence. 23:30. Still silence. Donovan knew. A missed signal was worse than a duress signal. It meant total compromise. It meant the platform and the asset were gone. He immediately initiated the shutdown protocol. Operation Sea Harvest was to be erased. He made one call to his superior in Berlin, using a secure line. "The Albatross has missed its window. We are dissolving the line." He then began the methodical process of destroying the operation. He went to the AMS office in Hamburg, a different, legitimate-looking front than the one in Rostock. He paid the local German staff a generous severance, informing them that Atlantic Meridian Shipping had been declared bankrupt by its Panamanian parent company, its assets seized by creditors. They were confused, but the money ensured their silence. Donovan spent the next 4 hours in his own office with a burn barrel. He destroyed every file related to AMS, the shipping manifests, the leasing agreements, the coded correspondence, and, hardest of all, the operational file for Klaus Becker, Rudolph. By dawn, there was no official link between the CIA and the defunct shipping line. The SS Osprey, the sister ship, which was docked in Copenhagen, was quietly ordered to a port in Italy, where it was sold for scrap. The exposure was a catastrophic failure. The agency had not only lost a trained asset, Becker, and valuable intelligence, the microdots, but they had lost the platform. The Stasi now knew the method. Infiltration by sea using this type of modified container was now compromised. The Black Ferry to Rostock was permanently out of service. Klaus Becker was not taken to a standard prison. He was transported immediately to the MFS Remand prison in Rostock, and 2 days later, he was transferred to Berlin-Hohenschönhausen, the Stasi's central interrogation facility. His reception was designed to induce psychological disorientation. He was stripped of his civilian clothes and given ill-fitting prison fatigues. His name was taken. He was now prisoner 218. He was placed in a cell in the U-boot, the subterranean windowless section of the prison. The lights were on 24 hours a day. There was no sound but the occasional clang of a steel door and the regular check of the peephole. The interrogations began 48 hours later. They were not violent. Major Schmidt, who had traveled to Berlin to oversee the case, understood that physical marks were poor form and yielded unreliable information. He preferred exhaustion, isolation, and leverage. The interrogation room was standard: a table, 3 chairs. Schmidt sat opposite Becker. A note-taker sat in the corner. "You are Klaus Becker," Schmidt began, opening a file. He did not ask questions. He stated facts. "You fled the Republic in 1953. You were recruited by the Amerikanischer Geheimdienst in Frankfurt in 1956. Your case officer is Arthur Donovan." Klaus stared at the table. He had been trained to resist, to give his cover story. "Your cover as an engineer," Schmidt continued, ignoring Becker's silence, "was thin. Your contact was Helmut Wenzel, a draftsman at the shipyard. The dead drop was a loose brick at the Marienkirche. The microdots are in our possession." Schmidt slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of Klaus's sister, Ilse, walking to her job at the local cooperative store in Rostock. "She is a good woman," Schmidt said softly. "A loyal citizen. She has applied for a university position to study history. It is very difficult to get a slot. The state has many applicants." Klaus looked up, his eyes hollow. "The leverage." "We know what you did, Herr Becker," Schmidt said, leaning forward. "That is not the question. We have the proof. We have your contact. We have the container. Your trial is a formality. You will be found guilty." He paused, letting the reality sink in. "The question is why. We want to understand the methods of Herr Donovan. We want to understand the mind of the CIA. Your cooperation will not change your verdict, but it can influence the context of your sentence. And," he tapped the photo of Ilse, "it can determine whether the state looks favorably upon your family or sees them as collaborators in your treason." The interrogations continued for weeks. Klaus was woken at random hours, forced to sit for 8, 10, 12 hours at a time, going over the same details. The sleep deprivation, the isolation, and the constant, implied threat to his sister wore him down. He held back on operational specifics, the training locations, the names of other recruits, but he confirmed the logistics of AMS, the signaling methods, the nature of Donovan's tasking. His trial took place 2 months later. It was a closed proceeding, lasting less than a day. The prosecutor read the charges: espionage in the service of an imperialist power. The evidence, including the microdots and Schmidt's surveillance photos, was presented. Klaus, advised by a state-appointed lawyer, offered no defense. He was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor, sent to the infamous Bautzen II prison, a facility reserved for political prisoners. Major Schmidt closed the file on Operation Anchor. It was a complete success. The ripples of the anchor failure spread far. In Langley, Arthur Donovan faced an internal review board. The hot wash of the operation was clinical, but the implication was clear. He had lost a multi-million-dollar platform and a human asset through what they termed procedural overconfidence. You ran the same route, with the same ship and the same container. Too many times, Arthur, his division chief said, stubbing out a cigarette. You built them a pattern. The Stasi just waited for the pattern to repeat. Donovan was censured. His field command was revoked. He was transferred from the dynamic, high-stakes Berlin station to a desk at Langley, assigned to Soviet maritime logistics. He would spend the rest of his career analyzing shipping manifests and radar reports, a logistician in exile, haunted by the very bureaucracy he had tried to weaponize. In East Germany, Major Marcus Schmidt was promoted to Oberstleutnant, Lieutenant Colonel. Operation Anchor became a case study at the MFS University in Potsdam, a perfect example of Geduld, patience, and meticulous counterintelligence. The HA-2 used the intelligence gleaned from Becker's interrogation, combined with their reverse engineering of the CIA's container, to tighten security at all GDR ports. They now knew exactly what to look for. The SS Albatross itself was repainted, renamed the Vorwärts, Forward, and absorbed into the GDR's state-owned shipping fleet. Captain Finch and the compromised crewmen were also tried. Finch received a 10-year sentence for conspiracy against the state. The other sailors, after a period of interrogation, were eventually declared persona non grata and repatriated to the West, arriving in Hamburg with nothing but the clothes they wore and a strict warning never to speak of their experience. The most tragic aftermath was for the families. The CIA's promises to Klaus Becker regarding his sister, Ilse, were now impossible to keep. Worse, the Stasi used her as leverage. Her university application was denied. She was informed that due to family connections to enemies of the state, she would be reassigned. She was moved from her clerical job in Rostock to a manual labor position at a textile factory in a rural town, placed under permanent low-level surveillance, a Zersetzung decomposition measure, to ensure she remained isolated and politically inert. The help Klaus had intended to provide had resulted in the quiet, administrative destruction of her life. Years turned into a decade. The Cold War settled into a long, grinding stalemate, punctuated by crises in Berlin, Cuba, and Prague. The era of audacious infiltration via shipping container gave way to the age of satellite surveillance and high-level signals intelligence. Arthur Donovan retired from the CIA in 1971. He moved to a small house in suburban Virginia, where he tended his garden and rarely spoke of his time in Germany. The failure of Sea Harvest defined his career, a quiet mark of shame in a service that only remembered its successes. Marcus Schmidt, by contrast, rose high within the MFS. By the 1970s, he was a general major, overseeing all counterintelligence for the northern coast. His success with Operation Anchor had built his reputation as a man who was thorough, patient, and politically reliable. He was a perfect functionary of the security state. In 1973, as part of Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik and the warming of relations between East and West, a list was drawn up for a humanitarian exchange. The West Germans sought the release of political prisoners, and the GDR sought hard currency. On that list was Klaus Becker, prisoner 218. He had served 15 years in Bautzen. The exchange took place not at the Glienicke Bridge, but at a quiet border crossing. Becker, now 51, was a ghost. He was rail-thin, his hair white, his eyes vacant from 15 years of isolation and hard labor. He was debriefed by the CIA in a West Berlin safe house. The new generation of case officers, men in fashionable suits who had never seen the inside of a modified container, found him unresponsive. He had little current intelligence to offer. He was given a new identity, a small pension, and an apartment in a faceless suburb of Munich. He tried to find his sister, Ilse. He learned that she had passed away in 1969 from pneumonia, exacerbated by years of poor living conditions and factory work. The leverage that had been used to recruit him and then to break him was gone. Klaus Becker lived out the rest of his life in profound, mistrustful silence. He was a casualty of a war fought with manifests and magnetic locks, a man erased by the very systems he was meant to subvert. The story of Atlantic Meridian shipping is not a tale of dramatic action. It is a case study in the true nature of Cold War espionage. It was a war of logistics, of patience, and of profound systemic paranoia. The operation itself, Sea Harvest, was a reflection of the CIA's mid-century mindset: audacious, technologically creative, and reliant on a belief in its own superior tradecraft. The modified container was a brilliant piece of engineering, but it was deployed with a logistician's arrogance, a belief that repetition equaled reliability. They failed to account for the methodology of their opponent. The Stasi, embodied by Marcus Schmidt, did not rely on superior technology. They relied on panoptic surveillance and the granular analysis of seemingly mundane data. Schmidt didn't need to see the agent, he just needed to see the receipts. He found the anomaly in the ledger book, the inefficiency that didn't align with a profit motive. The Stasi's greatest weapon was its bureaucracy and its absolute control over its environment. In this shadow contest, the patient, paranoid system of the East defeated the technologically ambitious system of the West. The fake shipping line was a clever idea, but it was a system, and systems create patterns. Patterns, to a man like Schmidt, were a confession. The ultimate legacy of AMS is one of cost. The intelligence Becker gathered, technical drawings of a submarine, was obsolete within a few years. The price for that temporary data was the seizure of a multi-million-dollar operational platform, the incarceration of several men, and the complete systemic ruin of Klaus Becker and his family. It highlights the deep moral ambiguity of the great game. Was Donovan a villain for leveraging a man's family? Was Schmidt a hero for diligently defending his state? Both men operated within the cold logic of their respective systems. The human element, Klaus's hope, Ilse's ambition, was merely collateral damage, a rounding error in the vast impersonal accounting of the Cold War. We appreciate you joining us for this archival deep dive. If you value this kind of historical analysis, please consider supporting the channel.